Welcome back, everybody. It's the Open Peace Podcast. And today we have Rabbi Yehuda Hakohen, who lives in a town near the mountain of Beit El in the West Bank. So, Rabbi, why don't you just explain to us a bit about your story, who you are, where you live, and why?
Okay. I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel from New York City almost 20 years ago. My parents had both moved to the United States from elsewhere. I was actually the first American born in my family. And neither of my parents, I don't think, have grandparents born in the same countries that they had been born in. So really, we had been homeless for about 2,000 years. And the last place that we had called home was here. I became, I grew up somewhat disconnected from the Jewish community. I grew up in a neighborhood that was mostly Irish and Albanian in New York City at the time. Some other people as well. And when I guess when I was about 20 years old, I became a little bit politicized, a little radicalized, started getting involved in Israel-related stuff, but in a very militant way. And when the second Intifada broke out, I remember feeling that it was wrong. I remember feeling that it didn't make sense to me that just because I had been born in New York, my job was to earn a college degree, while Jews my age here in Israel were expected to go fight. So at the time, I not really being from the Jewish community, I did what I thought any normal person would do. I dropped out of school when I moved to Israel, and I enlisted in the army. But they don't just give you a gun off the plane. You have to go through a draft period, a draft process. So I went to go check out. I figured if I had time to kill before entering the army, I would go learn in a yeshiva, go study in a yeshiva, learn some Torah. And I went to a place called Machon Meir. I don't know if you guys are familiar. So I went to Machon Meir. I'm a teacher there now. I teach there once a week. And, I participated in a lot of different type of political, organizing. I used to bring students to places like Hebron or Gush Katif, for programs. I started a few communities on different mountaintops in the West Bank. Then after the army, I was already married by the time I finished the army. We went to go live in East Jerusalem to start a new Jewish neighborhood in Ras Al Amud, which is Maleh Zetim. We were there for 4 years in the beginning. And really one of the side effects of me living there for 4 years was that I got to know Palestinians. At first, I started to understand their experiences really as being victimized by Fatah, by the Palestinian Authority. It took me a little while to process and to understand what we might be contributing to their situation, we as Israeli society. And by the time I left that neighborhood, which was already 12 years ago, I had already begun to organize dialogue sessions between Jewish and Palestinian activists, specifically the more radical, the more hardcore Jewish and Palestinian activists in the West Bank, to try to understand each other's stories and identities better, because it really is my belief that what the Jewish people are primarily looking for out of this project, what we've been doing here for the last 100 and so years, and what Palestinians are looking for, at least in my experience of the conversations I've had over the last 12 years, I really believe that the contradictions are very minimal, and that ultimately we can actually progress past this conflict. I think it's mostly a misunderstanding, even though I think the word misunderstanding might be an understatement. I think one of the reasons why this conflict continues to perpetuate is because both sides have a principled refusal to really understand the other as the other understands himself. And what we end up doing on both sides is we end up fighting our fantasy antagonists, meaning we both superimpose identities and ideologies and motivations on the other that have very little to do with how the other really experiences himself. And what that has done is it's essentially led to both sides engaging in very counterproductive methods of struggle, because we're fighting not the other as the other exists, but the other as we imagine him in our fantasy, in our own narrow narrative. This concept of narratives is important to me, by the way, because the way I would define a narrative is a collection of facts that are selectively chosen and contextualized within an ideological worldview. And when it comes to the last 101 years of conflict between us and the Palestinians, there are millions of facts, and both sides tend to take the facts, use the facts, select the facts that support the story we want to tell, and dismiss the facts that complicate the story we want to tell. So we're telling two very different stories, and we have two very different framings. I don't think we even agree on what the conflict is over. Most Israelis experience this as a conflict between competing nationalisms, and I think most Palestinians experience this as an anti-colonial struggle. We don't even agree on what the conflict is about. So, but because there's this almost principled refusal to understand the other on both sides, and fear of the other's identity, fear of the other's narrative, fear of the other's story, because if his story is true, maybe my story is less true, or not, exactly what I thought it was. As a result of that fear, we keep getting stuck in this counterproductive loop, in this cycle of conflict. So I'm very much of the belief, my life, my work, I'm head of the Vision Movement, or I'm one of the heads of the Vision Movement. And, we have a magazine for people who are interested, visionmag.org, or a website, visionmovement.org. I know you've had other members of our team on the show before. I think Rudy Rockman's been on the show before. And who should be free Bezrat Hashem sometime soon. We're
hopefully,
all...
yeah, sure, hopefully.
Yeah. And but we're all about identifying the next goals of Jewish liberation, really understanding what the next objectives of Jewish history are after Zionism, and to create a new Jewish liberation movement that can protect Zionism's positive achievements while at the same time correcting its flaws. So we're really in the midst of trying to, we acknowledge Zionism ended in 1967. We returned to Zion. And Zionism as an ideology doesn't really offer anything when it comes to our current challenges. Meaning Zionism was created to address problems our people no longer have. And now we need a new Jewish liberation ideology to address the challenges of this generation, of this chapter of Jewish history. And that's what we're really all about at the Vision Movement, trying to figure that out. Now, me personally, all of our members and organizers and thinkers are really, have the space to come to their own conclusions about what the goals of Jewish liberation are right now. For me personally, I would say reconciliation with the Palestinians, decolonizing Jewish identity, and freedom from the United States are really the three major objectives of this chapter of Jewish history.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. No, go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's very interesting because that's very close to my line of thought about the whole thing. So, I remember when I first started in the army, they sent me to Bikvei Alon, the place that they stick all the immigrants before they put us into the regular army. I remember one of our Mefekdot there asked me, is Zionism still necessary? As part of a little class thing. My answer was, not really. It's kind of over. We're a regular country, just like everywhere else now at this point. We are allowed to have free and fair debates about our own path as a nation. We speak our own language, like our culture is blossoming. And its mission was kind of succeeded. So I don't know. I just wanted to say, I'm pleasantly surprised that, for the first time, someone's kind of agreed with me on that.
Well, I think Zionism. First of all, I'm not sure that was the answer they were looking for.
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't at all. They kind of gave me a look.
Right. I think that Zionism is the ideological paradigm of Israeli society.
Yeah.
I think I think most of our major political parties are Zionist parties. And when I say Zionism, I mean something very specific. We from maybe more of a mystical perspective, we look at Zionism as the movement of Mashiach ben Yosef. The messianic force of Yosef, and that we understand to be the material rebuilding of Israel. That which we share in common with other nations. A government, an army, an economy, etc. A transportation system, a sanitation system, a healthcare system. All of those things that we share in common with other nations. That's Mashiach ben Yosef, the material, physical rebuilding of Israel in our land, going from gas form to solid form once again. But that's been largely successful, as you said. And now I think we need to fill that vessel, fill that state with content and direction, and decide, what did we come back to life for? What kind of world do we want to see? How do we want humanity to be better off as a result of the children of Israel coming back to life? And these are, I think, some of the questions we have to ask ourselves. And of course, we have to ask ourselves, how do we create the type of society here that really does express our people's identity and values in its policies and institutions, for the sake of ultimately not copying other civilizations just with Hebrew or whatever, but actually creating something new that the world hasn't seen, certainly not for 2,000 years, and that maybe the world's been waiting for. Maybe the world as it exists right now is not in great shape. Whether we're talking about the political level, or we're talking about climate change, or we're talking about any of the many challenges facing humanity today, it's my belief that Israel came back to life in order to create something new that can inspire the world, change the world, and lead humanity into a better future.
I really hope so, Yehuda. I really hope so. But I'd just like to push back a little bit on some of the things, because you're right. Like, the world is in turmoil, and we're seeing, horrors going on, and we're seeing climate change in front of our eyes. There's floods in Germany, heat waves in Canada. I just want to push back a little bit on where we are as a country, because yes, we're an established state. Yes, we are strong militarily, somewhat economically, not so much since we're in a debt at the moment, so that's an issue. We also have a lot of infighting going on between all kind of segments of society, and we don't have a clear vision for the future. There isn't, if you took like 100 Israelis into a room and you asked them, what's your vision for peace, or what's your vision for the future, you might have 200 opinions and not just 100 on what's going to happen. So
and that's okay. I mean, that's actually an expression of our identity.
Sure.
And therefore, I think it's actually very counterproductive, very problematic when our Knesset continues to raise the electoral threshold. When I moved to this country, there were parties in Knesset with one seat, and if you say, as you did, like what you were expressing was this famous, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And if that's our culture, then we should have small ideological parties in Knesset and not just these kind of blocks.
For sure. I don't have any problem with that, but I'm saying a kind of direction is getting lost in that. Like, let's say, looking at a final peace deal with the Palestinians, there are many, many different views on that. There's, federation model, there's one state model, there's 2-state model. There's many different options to take going forward. But we, as Israeli people, we don't have a consensus on which one we should take, or even which land we want. I mean, I don't know if you watched, Adar had a podcast with Ehud Olmert going over the Ehud Olmert plan and what he offered. And I'd like to know, from your point of view, I'm sure you're aware of that plan. How would you feel about, an Israeli government taking on a plan like that, which would potentially see somebody like yourself losing their home potentially, or leaving you within a Palestinian state?
Well, first of all, I'm against. Not only am I against, I'm interested in recovering some of the lands we've already lost. I haven't given up Gaza. I plan to return to Gaza, Yisrat Hashem, and I plan to return to Sinai. But I understand, especially when we're talking about Gaza, there's no way to return without genuinely offering the Palestinians in Gaza a better life with us as equal citizens of a democratic society.
Yeah. Okay.
So
also,
that was,
also Sinai though, as in
wait a second though,
Okay.
just before
All right.
before Sinai. So that would mean that you're all for a one-state solution with human rights
I'm
for
all
everybody.
for one. Yes, I'm all for a one-state solution. I'll put it this way. We can talk details if you like, but I prefer broad strokes just because when I believe that, again, I mentioned before that I think Jews and Palestinians here have been living in two different movies, two different narratives for the last 101 years. And I'm interested in a solution that can simultaneously be experienced as a happy ending in both ways. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a solution that causes both peoples to feel like our core grievances and aspirations have been met. So the way I envision that is a single state between the river and the sea, and that's democracy with full equality. I would actually say a participatory democracy, not a representative democracy, and with a Jewish character that's much, much, much deeper than the current Jewish character of the state, yet at the same time much softer. Right now, we essentially have a European-style nation-state with some Jewish decorations. And those Jewish decorations are too Jewish for the Palestinians here, and they're not Jewish enough for the Haredim. Now, Haredim and Palestinians are two very important populations when we talk about the future, because Haredim and Palestinians are two of the fastest growing populations in this country. Right? So any solution we talk about has to take not only Israeli society or Palestinian society as we currently stand, but also our trajectories. So we have to acknowledge that the Haredim are the fastest growing population between the river and the sea. After the Haredim, second place is really a tie between Jews like myself, what we call the national religious, and the Palestinians. And and I think that what we need is a state not with overtly Jewish skin, but with deeply Jewish organs and skeleton, so that the policies and institutions and the structures of the state are expressing a Jewish identity that every Haredi child can see and recognize, while people who are not Jews, or even Jews with very little Jewish education, will barely see. Will barely even recognize as Jewish. They'll just see a state with great policies and not know what inspires or gives birth to those policies. So I think that if we're able to achieve a one-state participatory democracy with a deep and soft Jewish character between the river and the sea, Palestinians and Jews, especially those of us who are most fully living our national stories, will actually achieve victory in the subjective narratives we're living in.
Where do the Palestinians fit in this? Because the Palestinians, a lot of them, want a Dawlat Palestine and a Palestinian state. Where would they fit into this one-state model? How would they feel about this?
As equal citizens who have access to everything that you and I have access to.
Yeah.
Okay,
but how do you square that with the character of the state being deeply, albeit softly Jewish? I'm just I could use a little bit of elaboration on that. Like, how do you envision that working?
Well, you're asking me about the Jewish character or the potential Palestinian character?
I'm asking about both, I guess you could say. The idea that you expressed, that where this state is essentially European with Jewish declarations, and how you could have a state that's Jewish to its core, but in a way where, say, somebody who's secular like me wouldn't feel it all that much. Somebody who has, very little Jewish education, but also non-Jews. Like, if you can explain that one.
For example, just a small example, if your dog were to damage my bicycle, okay,
Okay.
And we went to court. Now, right now, if that were to happen, the judge would most likely rule according to British common law. Like this,
Yeah.
right? Now, our people spent many, many, many centuries developing our own legal theory and our own ideas of justice for when one person's property damages another person's property. Right?
Yeah.
So-
Shulchan Aruch.
Well, or Bava Kama. Let's say in the Gemara. Now, if you and I go to court, and instead of the judge ruling according to British common law, the judge rules according to Bava Kama, which is our people's sense of what justice would be when one person's property damages another's. Is there anything in that choice to use Jewish law instead of British law that would be othering to a non-Jew, or offensive to a Jew who wants to live a Western lifestyle?
No. For me, I would say no, but I imagine there would be plenty of people who could tell you, yeah, it would bother me just by the very character of it being something called Jewish law, you know?
Well, you don't have to call it that. The judge would know. Meaning, my point is that I think before we talk about Jewish character of the state, I think we have to talk about Jewish identity. And part of the problem is we're often having this conversation within the paradigm of all these social constructs that we've existed before. Meaning, the people of Israel existed before the concept of race. The Jewish people existed before the concept of religion or ethnicity or nationality or culture, and we're often forced to define ourselves according to those boxes. I would say that the closest box to what we are is a civilization similar to, let's say, the Aztecs, right? Our civilization had a spiritual component, it had a territorial component, it had a national component, it had a legal component, but it was much more than the sum of those parts. Now, part of our problem is that we were destroyed and we were exiled from our land, and many components of our identity were kind of lost or taken from us, or at least paused, while at best we were kind of in exile. Our identity was reduced to like the spiritual and legal components. Now we've come back. We're rebuilding Hebrew civilization, essentially. I think that we're tasked in this generation with rebuilding Hebrew civilization, which is very exciting. And we have to figure out what that looks like, because we're not just a people that was colonized in its own land for a long period of time and eventually broke free. We were essentially exiled to the belly of the beast. And we spent many, 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 many centuries, especially Ashkenazi Jews, in the lands of our oppressors, inside the civilization that destroyed ours. And we're coming back here, with a lot of trauma and very deep colonization that we need to unpack and we need to deal with. I would say Palestinians are a major victim of our identity crisis and our need to unpack our own trauma and to decolonize Jewish identity. And we never did that. We basically fought the British, or I would say the Lechi, the Lochamei Chayut Yisrael, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, forced the British to make this country. And then our political leadership, the Zionist politicians, basically took down the Union Jack, took down the British flag, and placed a Jewish flag on a British system and called it a Jewish state. And we never had a real conversation over what this society we're creating is meant to be, what values should be expressed through it, what identity it should, manifest. We never really had that conversation. I think we've been avoiding that conversation. And I would even argue that a lot of the impulse for many Israelis, especially the more westernized and affluent Israelis, the impulse towards a two-state solution has been driven by not wanting to confront questions of identity and wanting to just say, you know what, let's just have a kind of bomb shelter, a Western-backed bomb shelter for the Jewish people in 367 borders, armed and funded by the Americans, and we can be an outpost of Western civilization, or as Ehud Barak likes to say, a villa in the jungle. Right? Now that's a very, that's a very colonial mentality, a very Orientalist mentality, and a very unhelpful mentality. I think
I agree with you. I agree that that's a very terrible mentality to have. And I can't believe you actually said something like that. It's pretty sickening to hear. The thing is, when you're talking to me about a one-state solution, I'm struggling to see a majority of Palestinians. Sure, some will be for it, and they'll want to join the team and live a great life. But a majority of them will push back and say, well, hold on, we want our own self-determination. We don't even want to take part in a Jewish democratic state. We don't want that. We want our own thing. We want our own autonomy. What can we do about people like that?
Well, I'll be honest, I'm a little bit uncomfortable having this conversation without Palestinians.
Sure, I agree, and it would be great if we could get some on. Maybe next time you could come on. We'll find somebody that's willing. Unfortunately, our Palestinian cousins sometimes, for their own security, don't like to come on as much as our Israelis.
But I will share some of my experiences. I'll say that in the last 12 years, I've been working with Palestinians for the last 12 years. And I think our conversations go pretty deep, like by design. Like we're doing something very similar to narrative therapy in our peace work. And again, we're specifically interested in bringing the Jews and Palestinians in the West Bank who are most fully living our national stories, who are willing to fight, kill, and die for what we believe to be important. Okay? So we're not bringing the quote-unquote moderates together. We're bringing the quote-unquote extremists together, those who've always been seen as the obstacle. And we're trying to put those Jews and Palestinians into the position of peacemaker. Okay? So I would say that in my experience, dealing with, some very, I would say very, I also happen to think that Palestinian society is a lot more politically sophisticated than Israeli society. And I'm not proud to say that. I hope that we can catch up to Palestinian society in terms of political sophistication. But part of what our movement does is try to push a more politically sophisticated conversation in Israeli society, especially among those Jews living in the West Bank. But in my experience, most Palestinians regard this nation-state idea, this concept, as a European social construct that was imported here by the British and French and was sold to them as a means to an end, not the end, meaning that they could achieve their rights and they could achieve liberation through a state. That was the whole Oslo paradigm. That was the whole, promise of the 1990s. It did not materialize. And I think we're seeing all over the place. We're seeing a rejection of the two-state paradigm in Palestinian society, especially among the younger generation. And the younger generation is important because the majority of Palestinians are the younger generation. And again, the Jewish people, I would also argue that Jews and Palestinians have a very different conception of national identity in general. Like I think that's an important component to this. We don't even agree. And that's why you often see so many Jews denying the existence of a Palestinian identity and so many Palestinians deny the existence of the Jewish people. So they're willing to acknowledge a religion called Judaism, but not a Jewish people. So I think that part of that is fear of the other's identity, but part of that is also that we define national identity so differently and in our respective cultures, and the other doesn't meet the criteria for what we think national identity is. So I think that for us, part of our identity and certainly part of our experience from the time the Romans destroyed our civilization until now has been this idea that we are going to return to our land, we're going to have political independence, we're going to have Jerusalem as a capital. These are things that have been driving us for the last 2,000 years. I mean, just the fact that Jews all over the world for the last 2,000 years would fast and mourn on the day that the Roman Empire broke through the walls of Jerusalem. And then again, 3 weeks later, on the day they destroyed Jerusalem. Meaning the fact that this has been such a central part of our culture, every wedding, every Passover Seder, every Yom Kippur, every Brit Milah, every life cycle event, every major festival, our focus was on the return to Jerusalem. And okay, a couple hundred years ago, Jews in Europe, especially Western Europe, experienced what we call the Haskalah, the Enlightenment, where we were basically offered inclusion and civil rights in the countries we lived in exchange for betraying our national identities and redefining ourselves as a religion. Meaning we were basically Palestinian refugees for 1,700 years, and then once the Europeans, specifically the French and the German, offered us inclusion and equality, we right away became Germans of the Mosaic persuasion, or Frenchmen with the Jewish religion. But that desire, what needs to be stressed, is that desire for inclusion in those societies is in and of itself the result of our oppression. Meaning we wouldn't have desired to be part of those societies, we wouldn't have desired to be German or French if we hadn't suffered very, very harsh, traumatic persecution for so long as a result of not being British or French, or German or French. And so I'd see even the drive within Jewish communities to absorb and fit in to their host nations in the diaspora is a manifestation of our oppression and part of our colonization we need to address and understand. So now that we're back here, we do need to revive Jewish civilization. But I think that also includes, well, what's the role of a non-Jew in a Jewish society? Meaning, can we, create, just like I think we should be creating a new kind of economic system that will be far superior to capitalism and actually, Bezrat Hashem, replace capitalism in the world. I think we should also be, creating a uniquely Jewish approach to minority rights that can eclipse the Western concepts of minority rights.
Well, you have Shivat Mitzvot Bnei Noach, no? How do you explain that in English, Rabbi Yehuda?
The seven mitzvot of the Noachites, the seven mitzvot of the children of Noach. I think those are some very basic, broad values that the majority of people in this country can sign on to, Jews and non-Jews alike. But again, I think that we need to, if we're going to be serious, especially when it comes to reconciliation with the Palestinians, we have to be willing to listen to what their real grievances are, how they've been experiencing the situation for the last 101 years. I would say 101 years because I think 1920 is really when this all kicked off. The British were very good at divide and rule tactics all over the empire. They were very successful at creating a conflict that didn't
Sure, they were, Yehuda, but we got to be careful, right? We got to be careful because sure, the British played their part not only here, but also in India, Pakistan, and in many other places across the world. They've had their hand in everything, but we've got to be careful about, putting all the blame on the British and not looking at ourselves as well.
At a certain point, it becomes our responsibility.
Yeah, 101 years.
It's always our responsibility, and even though there's a lot of blame that should be attributed to the British for starting this conflict and to the United States for perpetuating the conflict, I think that the number one thing that both we and the Palestinians are guilty of is allowing ourselves to be manipulated and driven into conflict against one another to fuel somebody else's interests. So 100%. Yes, there's always a responsibility to break free and to understand that even part of our oppression is being pushed into a role of oppressing. And I would also say that, we are even a little bit more responsible than the Palestinians, especially today, because the power dynamics really do favor us. And as a result of the power dynamics favoring us, I think we really need to take responsibility and make the first move towards building trust.
Yeah. Now, if I could make a pivot here to the influence of foreign powers in here, because this is something I come across with when I talk with my friends back home in the States about it, where they believe like Israel is practically the 51st state, whereas like most Israelis, like even me, like because as an American, I believe in America, you know, beacon on a hill and all that. But as an Israeli, I think Israel should start demanding a more equitable partnership with the United States because they do kind of treat us like a vassal, you know, and they kind of perpetuate this whole thing by just telling governments who would rather sit on their ass than actually do something about it. They're like, hey, no matter what you do, we have your back. You know, you don't, no need to change the status quo.
Well, I think it pushes towards doing what's in their interest. I think the Americans are selling weapons to not just both sides, but most parties in the Middle East right now. And low conflict is helpful for them, and control. And even the two-state paradigm is very much a paradigm that serves American and European interests.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, and, you know, for most part, I think people also, again, like in the West, or mainly Americans, because that's my area of expertise, they don't understand that. You know, they just kind of see Israel as like this manifestation of white Europeans just doing whatever they want when it's totally not the case. And they feel as if the United States has all the power to control the land. Meanwhile, like, they don't understand like basic facts, like about the military aid they give us. They don't give us loads of weapons or send sacks of cash. They give us store credit to be spent on the U.S. economy to buy weapons, which does nothing for us but helps their economy.
Well,
it's economic colonialism.
Right. No, it's essentially how imperialism functions today. Economic dependency. Also, I would say for the last four or so decades, the United States has worked diligently to erode Israel's independence and Israel's ability to act independently. You know, when we tried to create our own stealth fighter jet, the Levi, the Reagan administration pressured us to shut it down. They offered us F-16s. When I was a soldier, I had Israeli-made boots, and today the soldiers I see have American boots, and I know that the Israeli boot factory has been put out of business, and its workers lost their jobs. While, as you said, Lockheed Martin and Boeing are essentially getting American government subsidies. It's corporate welfare. It's an American government subsidy on arms industry, and this is basically how things work. We need to break free of that. Whether or not America is that beacon on the hill, I think that we have to ask ourselves what our values are and who we want to be friends with.
Of course.
I think we have, also you mentioned that Israel's perceived as an outpost of American power, as like the 51st state, you said. Part of that Israel's ruling class wants to be part of the West and not the Middle East. Like at the end of the day, the people who run our country, control our economy, and are leading our current government are Israelis who want Israel to be part of the West. And they look at our neighbors as backwards. And I think that we're not going to be able to really reconcile with our neighbors or decolonize our own identity unless there's at least a desire to indigenize into the region and to become an organic part of the Semitic region. And, when we talk, people like to talk about Israelis being indigenous to this land. And, I think that's an important point. Jewish indigeneity is an important conversation. If anybody's interested, I have an article on how complicated I think the subject is over at visionmag.org. But, ultimately, when we talk about Jewish indigeneity, it cannot be a Hasbara talking point. It cannot be a pro-Israel soundbite for why we're right and somebody else is wrong. It has to be about solidarity with other indigenous peoples and an identity that we actually internalize, that we actually want to return to who we are. I'm not talking pre-colonial mind. I'm not talking about going backwards and trying to recreate what the Romans destroyed 2,000 years ago. We can't do that. We have to recreate Jewish civilization in the 21st century according to how the world is today, but really to create something that can inspire the rest of the world. When people have this conversation about the state of Israel becoming more Jewish, often there's this fear in people's minds of like a Jewish Iran or a giant Haredi community. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about actually digging deep into our culture and identity and history to find structures and policies that are not just not just narrowly Jewish, but really universal and inspirational, but coming from a uniquely Hebrew source. And ultimately, I think we really did come back to life to lead humanity into a post-capitalist world and to bring the world somewhere better. But that really begins with us acknowledging our own role, our own identity, who we are, and what our role really is, as opposed to just trying to be like the West, but with shawarma and Hebrew and whatever.
Yeah, I agree that we definitely need to move away from a Western concept. We're in the Middle East; it's where we're from. And for all those that speak about European Jewry, and yes, we have a lot of European Jews here. We also have 1 million plus Middle Eastern Jews all over the Middle East: Syria, Lebanon, Morocco, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, who lived with, as you supposedly called, the backwards people, which in fact are not backwards at all.
I wasn't.
That wasn't what he said here.
I know. No, I get you. I'm just saying that the way the politicians that you were saying look at them as backwards is very, very wrong. Similar to what you said about Ehud Barak. Speaking of ingenuity and who's indigenous to the land, of course, Jews and Palestinians are both indigenous to the land. We have an interesting question here for you, Yehuda, from one of our viewers. From Nir, he says, I'm really interested to know, why is Gaza and Gush Katif so important to Rabbi Yehuda, since they aren't even part of biblical Israel?
First of all, Gaza is, of course, part of biblical Israel.
Yeah, for
part
sure.
of the tribal territory of Yehuda. It's part of our country. And for me, this isn't even about a Jewish right to the land. It's about a Jewish responsibility to the land. I feel responsible to make sure that there's justice in this entire country for everybody. And that means I feel responsible to have sovereignty over Gaza and over Shechem and over Hebron, and not just because this land is our soulmate, but also because we have a responsibility to ensure that there's justice for all people. And that does, of course, mean that every Palestinian should receive the same quality of education and healthcare and access to the political system and to resources, of course, and municipal funding as all the Jewish communities here. We have a responsibility to really create something that's inspirational and certainly doesn't treat half the population like they're a little bit less human.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And you've actually got one of our viewers here, Adib, who is a Bedouin friend of ours from Rahat, said, I would totally vote for Rabbi Yehuda. We have so much to accomplish as a society, and you are awesome. So
so any political runs in the future, you have at least one voter.
No, I'm a teacher. I like being a teacher. I have worked in party politics. I worked on, I think, 3 national election campaigns.
Ooh, my condolences.
Right, and the experience was enough to turn me off from the political system, certainly as it currently exists. And I really enjoy teaching, and not only teaching. This movement we're creating, the Vision movement, is, in my opinion, really what's necessary for Jews here and for the diaspora. I think we really need to think of ourselves as participants in Jewish history, as characters in the story of Israel, and we need to create a new generation of thought leaders, not to be students of Herzl or Jabotinsky or Ahad Ha'am, but to be the new Herzls and Jabotinskys and Ahad Ha'ams, meaning we want to inspire young Jews here and in the diaspora to see themselves as the thought leaders of a post-Zionist Jewish liberation movement that can protect Zionism's positive achievements, but at the same time clean up its mess, acknowledge its flaws, and try to correct what was done here.
Okay. So much to go from there. Yeah. Well, as you said, you have to be gone soon, so we have about 10 minutes left.
If you want the next 5 minutes, I could try to stick around an extra 5 minutes. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it could be a bit helpful. I just don't want to, I don't know, ruin your schedule. I'm just trying to think of, I don't know, one final question, to suck up the remaining time before I apologize to everyone that this is going to be a shorter episode. You got something, Amir?
We've got an interesting one here, which is going back to the one-state solution that you proposed, Yehuda. It's quite an interesting one, considering where we live. Jordan has wrote, "Who gets the guns in this solution?" Bit of a simplistic question, but
it's an important one.
It's an important one.
Yeah, no, it's an important question because it addresses something that we haven't spoken about: the fact that we don't trust each other.
Yeah.
And as I said before, I think it's Israel's responsibility to make the first move towards building trust, but in a context where we do have the guns. I mean, that's the reality right now. We have the guns. There needs to be a process of building trust. I hope that it could be a relatively speedy process, but I think that, in my opinion, the first step would be tearing down the wall. I think that tearing down the wall would be a gesture that Palestinians could take seriously, and at the very least, we'd have their attention in terms of saying, "Listen, we want to do something new now." I also think that it would be helpful and just correct, just if the government of Israel would start sending every month Palestinian civil servants a paycheck, the same paycheck that Israeli citizens with the same jobs receive. Meaning right now, not most, but a high percentage of Palestinian society in the West Bank are civil servants. Policemen, hospital workers, bus drivers, teachers, who are dependent on the Palestinian Authority for their livelihood, which is one of the reasons that the Palestinian Authority still exists, despite even recent protests. And I think that a lot of these civil servants are making roughly 25% of what Israeli citizens in the same jobs are making. So a gesture before taking down the wall, even before opening up dialogue, I think that Israel could try is simply, without any strings, to start sending out paychecks to every Palestinian civil servant that they could receive in their mailbox alongside their Palestinian check, and just let that happen for 6 months before we even open up dialogue. And of course, when we do open up dialogue, it has to be with an organic leadership, not with Fatah, not with Hamas, but with people, community leaders, and that will look different in different places. In the more traditional sectors of Palestinian society, we're talking about clan heads, and maybe certain Islamic leaders, and in the more, westernized, modernized sectors of Palestinian society, that might look, community organizers who are really operating on the grassroots level. And I think that we should really, empower those who are really representatives of their people, and involve them in this process. I think it should start with us tearing down the wall, but also being very clear that many Israelis are nervous, and part of this is proving to our own public that that some of these measures, especially the more what I would call the more colonialist features of Israeli society and Israeli policy, they're not necessary for our security. And we can, if we have to fight, we'll fight. I'm not against, violence if it's necessary, but I don't like the oppressive structures. And I do believe it is my belief, after 12 years of doing this work, that the majority of Palestinians who support some kind of political violence do so not because they're influenced by some kind of ideology, but rather because they feel oppressed. And I think if we remove that oppression, the vast majority who hate us will at least be able to shift slightly, or learn to experience us differently. And if there are still those who want to fight us and use violence against us, then I would be a lot more comfortable retaliating in full force than I am in a situation where I kind of feel like this is the result of us behaving unjustly. I want to know that we're behaving justly. I want to know that we are behaving morally, that we are not, that we're not just oppressing millions of people while convincing ourselves it's all in the name of security. I want to behave properly, and if it turns out we need to be violent, we'll be violent. But I don't think we'll have to be. I think the majority will. If it's very clear that we have changed, I think there'll be openness, at least in certain sectors of Palestinian society, enough that we'd be able to move forward together. But it would be a process, meaning it wouldn't be an overnight thing. I don't think we can just give everybody full citizenship and freedom of movement overnight. I think we're going to have to make first moves, but obviously as the process progresses and things level, we're going to, of course, require some reciprocity.
Well, we definitely need to try something different, Yehuda, because, our recent history, we've had conflict in 2006, 2008-9, 2012, 2014, and so, I'm all for trying a more holistic approach and going down that kind of more reconciliatory route and taking down, like you said, some of the barriers of oppression. I'm just wondering, is Israel ready for a Berlin Wall moment? Like you said, is the public ready for something like that?
I'll tell you the maybe counterintuitive, at least my perception. I don't want to say the truth. I want to say my perception, which might be counterintuitive to you or some of your viewers. I think the sector of Israeli society that is most advanced and most ready are the Jews living in the West Bank. The Jews who are fully living Jewish history, psychologically living in Jewish history and ready to fight, kill, and die for what we believe to be important to our story, what was important to our ancestors and what's important to us. I think those are the Jews who have the... and that's why I was so disappointed, by the way, with Bezalel Smotrich not being willing to sit with Mansour Abbas in the government. I actually really wanted to see Smotrich and his party sitting with the Ra'am party, sitting with a Palestinian party, and actually creating a new kind of relationship. I think part of the problem is that for the last 40 years, our most westernized and disconnected Israelis have monopolized our relationship with the Palestinians. And I think that, part of the work I'm involved in is really trying to bring the Jews who are most connected to their identities, to their histories, to their homeland, into contact with Palestinians. So, so we can meet them and change the way we experience them in our movie, but also so they can meet us and change the way they experience us in their movie. And I'm a big believer that the Jews, not only the Jews living in the West Bank, but the more quote unquote extreme Jews living in the West Bank should be on the front line of reconciliation work with Palestinians. Like those are the Jews.
I fully agree. I fully agree with that, Yehuda. And I also think that, connecting between all the different Jews in our society is critical for balance and harmony in Israel. So, you're from like the National Zionist camp, and we have ultra-Orthodox of all different types, and Hasidim, and then you have a secular community, and then you also have an Ethiopian community, and you also have a Samaritan community, and you have a Christian community, and you have all these different communities that we need to sit down and talk and understand what are each other's problems. Because I can imagine that the issues facing West Bank Jews in Judea and Samaria and Palestinians in Judea and Samaria are different to Bedouin issues in the south of the Negev and different to issues facing minorities and Jews in the Galil. So I think your idea about localized power and giving power back to local leaders that really have lived in their community and understand their community, understand the needs of the community is definitely a good way to go. I just want to mention, you mentioned Rudy earlier. I just would like to mention that our friend Rudy is currently detained in Nigeria, and I know there's a hashtag going around. We saw it in the chat earlier. I think it's hashtag free the three.
It's not, by the way, it's not only, I mean, Rudy has the most fame of the three, but it's important to mention it's also another one of our people, Noam Liebman, There's also another guy, David, who I've never met, who I don't know, but we want him free too. So we say free Rudy, free the three, whatever hashtag you're comfortable with. I'd like, Rudy's a very close friend of mine. I'd like to see him home. Noam is a close friend of mine. I'd like to see him home. I'd like to see David home as well. David, and really, as of now, the families are working quietly through diplomatic channels to free our friends, and we're giving them an opportunity to exhaust that approach. If it works, we're very happy, and if it doesn't work, we're obviously going to have to get much louder and much more aggressive.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. We do have a couple more questions just before you do go. I think they're quite important ones as well. Adib asks, how do Arabs and Jews work together to bring unity in the face of division in our politics and on social media?
You could bring up the question too, Amir. Just hover over it and click it.
Mate,
so
I'm technically challenged. We need
Yeah,
So
I can't do it either. I got locked out of all the admin stuff. I don't know how to get back in.
So I'll tell you, I think that it really, in my opinion, there are three barriers. There have been three major barriers to us being able to move forward, Palestinians and Jews together. One has been the two-state paradigm. As long as we're thinking within the context of a two-state paradigm, we're not going to be able to move forward. We're going to think of Palestinians as enemies. We're going to be the enemies to them. And there are many of us who are not willing to divide this land. And also, I think a lot of different tactics in terms of, the way, I want Jewish communities in the West Bank. I'm interested in having more Jewish communities in the West Bank, but I'm not for building on private Palestinian land, and I'm certainly not for uprooting anybody. I want us to be able to live together, and I want to be told, where we can build. I don't need, if it was very clear where we could build, and where we can create our own communities, or even maybe eventually joint communities, which would be nice. Then we wouldn't have to just take any hill we can, or which sometimes turns out to be state land or Palestinian land or whatever. I think that and same thing in Jerusalem. The reason why there's so much contention over like this neighborhood or that neighborhood is many Jews legitimately feel that in a two-state paradigm, we're at risk of losing Jerusalem or parts of Jerusalem, and therefore we have to fight to get into and have Jewish communities in every neighborhood we can. And if the two-state paradigm isn't the paradigm we're functioning within, then a lot of the pressure is alleviated, and we don't have to fight over things. And territory proper becomes much less politicized. So first of all, I think the two-state paradigm is so counterproductive, and it's led to so much blood and so many problems, and we need to just discard it completely. Another obstacle is, we mentioned earlier, kind of a combination between Israel's, at least our ruling class, and wanting to be part of the West and not the Semitic region, combined with the insistence of so many Palestinians and so many of our neighbors to see Israel as part of the West and not as an organic part of the region. And I think the third obstacle is being so afraid of each other's stories, actually feeling threatened by the story and identity of the other. One of the ways that I think we can really start changing this reality here is just by challenging ourselves, on the Jewish side, let's say, challenging ourselves to really understand the Palestinians from their own perspective, not the role they play in our story, but from their own perspective. And I would ask the Palestinians to do the same. It's not easy. I know I'm asking a lot, but I think it can go a long way. And by the way, even if we're not interested in peace, even if we're interested in destroying the other, in total victory, in zero-sum game, it's still strategically, it makes sense to know the enemy and to fight them according to how they actually exist and not how they exist in our fantasy. It's not even a productive method of struggle if we want to win, to impose these like fantasy identities on each other. And I think, by the way, a lot of the policies we see I could give you a very clear example. The way Palestinians often fight us. They see themselves as waging an anti-colonial struggle. They see us as a settler colony, like the United States or Canada or Australia, and they fight us using anti-colonial tactics. Now, anti-colonial tactics are designed to make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation. If you could make the price of occupation more expensive than the benefits of exploitation, the occupier in most cases will leave. That's actually how we beat the British. When the Lehi fought the British, they basically identified British economic interests in the region, like the Haifa oil refinery, for example, destroyed it. And then it only took a couple more dead British soldiers until the empire announced they were leaving. So the problem is, if Palestinians insist on experiencing Israel and relating to Israel as this European settler colony and fight us as if we are, they'll adopt methods of struggle that are not connected to our reality and will not be effective in fighting us. And that's what happens. You mentioned all these recent conflicts. They're all basically, it's the same story each time. And they're just continuing to not recognize, even if they don't want to see us as indigenous, they have to understand that Israeli society, sociologically, psychologically.
You muted yourself, Yehuda.
I don't know how that happened. Okay, somebody. I'm being censored.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just trying to make the point that, Israeli society, whether you want to argue we're indigenous, we're not indigenous, Israeli society, before we even knew the word indigenous, related to ourselves as indigenous. We related to ourselves as a people from this land, deeply connected to this land, with nowhere else to go. And if you fight us using tactics that, meant to make us retreat to somewhere else, we're going to respond like a native people with superior firepower that feels threatened. And that's what happened in 2009 and 2014, et cetera, et cetera. And the only way, honestly, in my opinion, to stop these flare-ups from continuing every couple of years is to acknowledge we made a mistake, go back to Gaza, rebuild the Jewish communities that were destroyed there, dismantle Hamas, offer Palestinians living there a better life together with us as Israelis. And I think, by the way, Gaza has a tremendous crisis with overpopulation right now, and the vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. They came from somewhere else in 1948. I think that an incredible gesture on Israel's part would really be to offer any Palestinian in Gaza who wants, the choice is theirs, to go back to where they came from in 1948. Israel will build brand new luxury apartments that they will own outright, no mortgage. It's a great way to, to solve the overpopulation crisis in Gaza. It's a great way to redistribute wealth. It's a great way to address refugee issues. And it, of course, allows us to have Gaza again, rebuild Gush Katif. And again, if we're anyway relating to Gaza as part of our state, then demographically, it doesn't matter if Palestinians are in Gaza City or in Haifa or in Akko or Yafo or Beersheba.
That would be a real start. It would be a real start to offer things like that. I just think it's a bit far-fetched from what we've heard in the political sphere in the last decade or so. Nobody's mentioning those kinds of things, and unfortunately, these peace deals, like with Egypt and Jordan, they get made at the top. So it would be great if we heard more views like yourself. I just want to end it on something one of our viewers put in, because it's very interesting. Adib says here, my dad always told us that if you want people to improve, you give them tools and not carrots. Money does not solve every issue, and sometimes it causes more problems. Let's take responsibility for peace.
Smiley face.
Smiley
Don't forget
face,
the
yeah.
smiley face.
And I
It's
think
important.
Yeah, it is important. And I think that's really, really key, because unless we, the people, Israelis, Jews, non-Jews, Palestinians want it, like you said, we can go and achieve it. We have very highly educated populations, very dedicated to the land itself, very dedicated to their friends, to their family. So I really do hope that one day we can strive for a better future over here. And I just want to thank you, Yehuda, for taking the time out of your day to speak with us. It's very important that we have these conversations, and I really hope that maybe another time you're able to join us with maybe a Palestinian guest, and we can dig down deep into some of the issues over in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, and see how we can tackle them head on. So
Sure, I'd be happy.
thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And I mean, oh, it's been our pleasure, really, and I'm just glad we got to make it to over an hour.
Yeah.
I was a bit worried about the time crunch, but we're gonna let you go. So typically, how we end this is I smack the show out of existence.
Okay.
Typically, if Abood was here, he would talk about his family's tahini factory, but he's not.
Very
So we're not
cool.
going to mention it. We're not going to, chat. We're not going to. All right. You ready, Amir?
I'm ready. Thank you again so much, Yehuda, and I hope to hear from you soon. And all the best to you and your family.
Yeah. It was fantastic speaking with you. All right, everyone, the episode's over.